Time sure does fly. Over 2 years ago now, Insomniac's first big PS5 exclusive launched with Rift Apart. It was the talk of the market at the time due to its elaborate use of the PlayStation 5's fast access SSD and streamlined memory subsystem. Now, thanks to the PC porting professionals in Nixxes, they have the biggest challenge yet. Just how does this compare on the best on PC, scaling from the Steam Deck right up to high end, and with it being the first title shipped using Direct Storage 1.2 and GPU decompression, will you have a hard time using a hard drive? We covered the core technology updates and overall PS5 performance in our performance review back at launch. Here we're going to focus on the PC port. The port here has been handled by Nixxes, working alongside Insomniac again and building on their excellent work from the previous Spider-Man releases on PC. Now, as a PS5 exclusive, this game is likely the current poster boy for what a team can deliver when building a game and engine around a fixed piece of hardware, even more than the Spider-Man releases from the same team. The offloaded data management compression, near instant access of that SSD has been pivotal in maximising the total 16GB of GDDR6 RAM the PS5 sports. Starting at the very top with the PlayStation 5's 120Hz VRR Fidelity mode, this has the game set to maximum, which is practically identical to the high settings on PC, with very high textures and ray trace reflections, but I will cover the settings later in this video. Using my RTX 3080 paired with a Zen 3 5800X 3D CPU, we have a machine that is, on paper, significantly faster than the PlayStation 5. Backing this up is 32GB of DDR4 RAM and a 3.6GB per second NVMe SSD. The card itself also supports and runs on a PCIe 4x16 motherboard, enabling a maximum of 32GB per second to come from the SSD into system RAM over to the VRAM as required, and vice versa. Finally, rounding up the card is only 10GB on this 3080, which is a limiting factor, as I've been talking about for the past few years on these performance reviews, and we'll see that borne out in the results here at times, but more on that later. Running at the same settings with Insomniac's Temporal Injection AA in its DRS mode at 45 FPS target, which is likely the same as what the PS5 uses in its VRR mode, as you see here, the PlayStation 5 scaled from a full 3840x2160 down to approximately 1440p, but this has all the same settings as that 30 FPS mode and the best ray tracing for sure, using a checkerboard reconstruction from its 1080p base back up to 4K, again approximate counts. The PC here should have all the advantage in any CPU and pure GPU workloads, and we do see this in the highs.
Crushing defeat is all it takes to stop me? I mean, yes.
Compared to the fidelity mode on the PlayStation 5, it hits a high in these tested sections of 48 FPS and a low of 38. The PC, meanwhile, with rebar turned on, hits a high of 60 FPS, its capped limit on this point, and a low of 23, which is where these streaming issues come in. But what we can see over the course of play here, both in combat, which isn't impacted by SSD and memory streaming issues, the PC can exceed the PS5, but not by a considerable amount. 12 FPS, or around 25% faster, although that would be more if it was uncapped, but not by a great margin. But on average, the PlayStation 5 comes in with 43.3, very respectable, and the PC 48.3, which is only 11% faster than the PlayStation 5 in its equal mode. But where the differences really come out is on those lows, with the PS5 being 65% higher on its lowest point of 38 FPS, and the PC here at 60% of that PlayStation 5 output. This means you get a far more inconsistent performance rate when it is streaming and moving through the world, which can happen quite often in the title, but when you're not doing that, then the PC does tend to flex more of its performance level, even though the average run of play here provides an 11% advantage to this PC configuration. This would be worse if it were not the PCIe 4 the system supports, along with rebar or smart access memory for AMD cards, which was enabled in these tests, aiding latency and ultimate performance on PC, due to the extensive shared memory pools between system RAM and VRAM. demonstrating how much rebar increases performance on PC using the exact same section here, but aided further with a lower resolution in DLSS 2's quality mode, rebar off versus rebar on. We can see an average performance uptick of 30% in these like-for-like sections, and our frame time lows are 100% worse with this disabled, demonstrating how much data is being shared along that PCIe bus and how destructive the latency can be for frame times. Something the PlayStation 5 does not need to contend with due to its single pool of GDDR6 RAM being shared between GPU and CPU as required. That said, in these non-streaming and heavy memory bandwidth bound sections, the performance levels are better on PC, and if you play around with the settings, you can even go way above 120 FPS on this machine, but do expect some severe dips and judders throughout your play, and certainly in these fast moving sections. One of the big benefits that Insomniac added to all of their PlayStation 5 releases is options, which brings them closer to PC, having multiple options to play the game. Many may not know that both the performance mode and the fidelity mode have the option of turning on a 120Hz screen plus VRR. This means that you can go up to 40 FPS in that fidelity mode, and if you have a VRR screen, as you see here with my capture, then it unlocks that frame rate, effectively running at a high point of 8 milliseconds, allowing it to hit upwards of 100 FPS at certain points, and it does actually hit that in the 120 FPS mode for performance. Performance RT can hit somewhere around 110 to 112 FPS in my tested high points, but generally it hovers somewhere around the 75s to 90 FPS range, and this is what we have used here for these tested sections to compare it to the very best on console to the very best on PC. But there are some reductions in that performance RT mode, again I'll get to the end of this video, but comparing that to the similar settings I can match on PC as close as possible anyway, what we can see in these comparisons is again an average frame rate of 81.28 FPS for the PlayStation 5, bested by the RTX 3080 here with an average of 94.98, which means that is 16% faster than the PlayStation 5 on average, and its highs are also slightly faster, only a meager 3%, 111 versus 107. But overall, again, we see a similar situation in those lows. A low point on the PlayStation 5 of 60 FPS versus a low point on the PC here of 45 FPS. Some 33% improvement on those frame time lows. And we can also see worse frame times on both are improved significantly. They're halved on PlayStation 5 down to 50 milliseconds as its worst frame time, and almost halved on PC to 166 milliseconds. But it still leaves the PC trailing the PlayStation 5 by 333% on frame time lows. But both versions feel much better in this performance RT mode, far more consistent because the frame times are much smaller and therefore closer together, and it leaves it as my recommended settings for PS5 and on every PC tested, unless of course you're running DLSS 3 with a 4090. I unfortunately don't have access to one.
How bad is it? Well, it is certainly not good. Great!
So what about exceeding the PlayStation 5 then? It all depends on what hardware you have and what you're looking for. Pushing the sliders up to max with 4K DLSS 2 quality settings on my RTX 3080, we can improve on PS5's image quality, some FX and ambient occlusion being the most obvious. But my RTX 3080 does not have sufficient compute power and certainly VRAM to make that step really. And in fact, I would assume even a 4090 may actually require DLSS 3 to hit a locked 60 FPS at these levels. In this small boss battle, we see big stutters due to even greater data demands than the previous modes, plus we hit both fill rate, bandwidth and clear VRAM limits, causing page swapping with system RAM, which even at the fidelity matching settings can exceed 12 GB of game allocation in system RAM, and it's constantly at 10 GB maximum VRAM. This doesn't significantly lower even if you go down to 1440p, and it's one of the reasons why you need to balance texture details in this game, which highlights a key aspect of this and more games this generation. Repeating myself, I know. Using this game as a base, a 16GB VRAM card would be required to match or exceed the PlayStation 5 asset details, which does align with the very high texture settings on PC here. A 12GB card may also be able to achieve this, but that's not confirmed as I do not have one to test. But that would at least achieve the high level, which can be a stretch even on my 10GB RTX 3080 here. But you can see my recommendations for texture settings and resolution. I would recommend either Insomniac's Temporal Injection, DLSS, XeSS or FSR2 for all PCs no matter what, to achieve those resolution targets via a lower base and then reconstruction and sharpening pass on top to get back to the output levels. Overall, you can improve the image quality on PC, but if you do here on an RTX 3080 or lower, do expect performance to be worse than on the PlayStation 5, and overall you really should be targeting the same level as the PlayStation 5 to either match or slightly exceed those performance targets. An extreme example of this and why 10GB is really insufficient to go close to or above the PS5 here, the game can run out of memory after playing for a while, and this then has to clean up and allocate address space as you play, causing impact on that gameplay performance. Changing settings during the game can also cause this when VRAM limited. The game becomes memory bound as you see here, and each frame takes around 250 to 300 milliseconds to render. After 30 seconds or so, the issue resolves and we return to being GPU bound. Nixxes will continue to work and improve this, but just be aware that only a 16GB card would likely be safe from this occurring at PS5 Fidelity matching settings, and maybe beyond those. As you see here with 10GB and 32GB of system RAM, this will cause unplayable sections at times, and why I recommend going below that PlayStation 5 setting on 10GB or lower cards. The tests so far have seen the best case on PC in regards to SSD speeds. Around 2 to 3GB per second seems to be sufficient for the game. We've been never seeing any more than approximately 1.2GB of data streaming from the SSD. But going down the stack than an old mechanical hard drive was one big aspect the team stated would impact the game design and certainly presentation. Putting that to the test with a medium spec PC here in my RTX 2070, we have a fast 600MB per second SATA 600 SSD versus a good 7200 RPM hard drive. And as we can see here, the game's performance is severely impacted in the same data streaming heavy segments. During this Portal battle, we see even frame time highs can be impacted, 51 versus the 60 FPS cap, some 17% impact. But it's not all bad though, with frame time lows actually being slightly better on the hard drive. And what this does reflect is the hard drive version is actually buffering the data into system RAM, and it slows down the Portal jumps at times, which actually reduces the impact on the GPU, as the faster drive gets the data into VRAM quicker, and thus the GPU has to balance the render work with the decompression work of those assets, which can cause slightly worse stutters during these moments, but approximately 2 frames at 60 FPS. The game dynamically reacts to the data bandwidth and tries to keep this section within the limit, and it can start streaming data sooner on the hard drive by using the system RAM as a big buffer, with the SSD being a non-buffered direct copy from SSD to system RAM to VRAM. Ultimately though, we get much lower performance rate during these sections and slower runs of the warps on the hard drive versus the SSD, which leaves hard drive owners with a far worse presentation of the game during any data streaming moments, and worse still, an average 30% lower performance than this SSD players. But if you call this playable, then a hard drive is playable. Also of note is as the hard drive creates this cache for its buffers into system RAM and then copies it over to the GPU via a compute job most likely, the second time you run this section on a hard drive, the data is already in RAM and it will run much smoother, which is what many online tests have been showing. If you play the game elsewhere or reboot the system, then this won't be true. But the first uncached version, as you see here, will be significantly worse than any SSD powered machine, like for like.
At least it was a round trip.
So wrapping up the HD test, well, effectively you get the same game when you're not streaming data, but that does happen often enough in this title, probably around 25% of gameplay, for it to be a severe impact on the overall presentation. The other word of note, as you see here, again around bandwidth limitations and that PCIe Express, ensure that that is set to 16. If you have a PCIe 3, then again ensure it's set to 16. As you can see here, even those cards, when limited to ×8, which only gives you 8 GB per second bandwidth between system RAM and VRAM, means you can severely impact performance, as you see on these tested sections, causing the game to be very memory bound due to the fact that it's constantly juggling data between system RAM and VRAM, which brings me back to my point earlier around ensuring you set the textures and resolution to the right level that matches your VRAM allocation of GPU. Otherwise, as you see here, you'll lose around 30% of overall performance on your GPU, which is far worse than the same issues we saw on Spider-Man Remastered, showing how much they're pushing that data throughput higher.
Give me the part, Pierre.
Time and again, I tell you, my heart is taken. And yet...
Rusty Pete?
Rusty? Mon Dieu. Your friend has a saucy tongue.
So moving down the stack and ensuring our mid-range PC is given the best chance, we have a full ×16 PCIe 3.0 set and that SATA SSD running the game, as this game uses GPU decompression, a first for any shipped game via Direct Storage 1.2. We see lower overall CPU requirements than Spider-Man due to that work moving to the GPU, when textures are at high or above at least. Below this, the CPU then handles the decompression as before. But there is no such thing as a free lunch. And as I noted in prior videos, moving work to the GPU, compute queues can and will impact render work from time to time. So we do see GPU demands higher due to this, and also the increased render work, RT quality and FX this game pushes overall. It's an absolute stunner even 2 years on. As such, my RTX 2070 with an overclock struggles too much at DLSS 1440p levels, and by setting to 1080p with TAA and high textures, we get the best image quality and performance balance, as you see on screen, with the non-streaming sections being fully GPU bound and still dipping below 60 FPS. But once we start streaming data, we can see bigger dips and then reduced GPU workloads for small sections as it waits for data, and then it's swamped with 2 times work in half the time. As such, we see much worse performance lows than even the PS5's Fidelity VRR mode, but we are running matched settings to the PlayStation 5's Ray Trace mode in performance, or as close as possible. In those settings, we are rarely, if ever, CPU bound, but it does highlight that the game is around 15% or more demanding on GPU performance than both previous games, and this needs to be reflected in your expectations and settings. For a locked 60 FPS outside of the Portal segments, then turn off all ray trace options and set to 1440p DLSS 2 DRS. And that will provide an excellent version to play that is close enough to the PlayStation 5's performance mode to never stand out and be equally as enjoyable. Beyond this though, the performance issues and VRAM demands can mean a 30 FPS cap with dips, which I know is sacrilege for PC players, and that's why I recommend the on-screen settings for this machine or thereabouts. Now for AMD players, as currently they have no ray trace options until a patch comes later from Nixxes to add them back in, then these are the same recommendations just with higher textures and resolution if you have bigger and faster cards. You can also push the other settings such as ambient occlusion higher if you have a better card. And finally, the game is fully Steam Deck verified, and that really is a testament of how good this port is and how well it actually scales. 60 FPS is really out of the question even at the lowest settings, but that's not a surprise. But setting the game to 900p FSR2 DRS at low settings with medium textures and high traffic, you can get a pretty good proxy of what a potential PS4 version may have been like. Sure, you will still see dips into the 20s, largely memory bandwidth bound as you see here in these pocket dimensions, but the game maxes out all 8GB of VRAM on the system and then page swaps from the SSD or SD card. Again though, I recommend running this on the SSD, as the SD card will have similar issues and performance problems as the hard drive version tests earlier. But with all those expectations taken into account, this is still the same 3D platformer come shooter in your hands, and it looks pin sharp on that 800p screen and loses none of its charm but gains even more portability. I can recommend this on the Steam Deck as a perfect game for the mighty handheld, and I really have enjoyed playing through it again on the train or wherever I'm out and about.
Will you please stop running? Is this some kind of test? It is, isn't it? Hey, wait!
There he is! The football!
Hey, wait! Oh boy. I'll handle this, Phantom. You just get to safety.
With all the important information out of the way, just what are those pesky PlayStation 5 settings then, and how much can PC improve? Well, the performance, ray trace and fidelity mode are not drastically different, with resolution and frame rates being the biggest. Fidelity tops out at 2160p and 50 FPS, and bottoms out at 1440p from my counts in the VRR mode. And performance ray tracing tops out at 1440 and 110 FPS, with 1080p being the lowest count. Regard settings, ray trace resolution is lower, but relative to the resolution targets both use a reconstruction element, but fidelity is much cleaner and more detailed. Both can have ghosting from that TAA pass, but ray trace performance also reduces the cutoff on reflective materials, resulting in less surfaces being reflective. In addition, depth of field, level of detail, particles and hair are reduced to medium in this mode, and that's about it. The performance mode without ray tracing bumps depth of field back up to high and increases that dynamic resolution scaling to approximately 1800p with the same 1080p base. Of note is the SSR reflections in this mode are actually lower than the base setting on PC, which is high, as the quality is the same, but again the amount of surfaces that use the SSR samples is reduced slightly over PC's high. The differences are minor in reality, and even zoomed in they do not stand out. I also noted some bugs on PC, with the PlayStation 5 matching the object range of 8 in all modes, but on PC 9 and 10 actually reduce detail on shadows and objects, which makes it worse. Now this is likely a bug in the menu, and I recommend 8 to match PlayStation 5. The biggest increase in level of detail in fidelity mode matches the highest level for NPCs, but PC increases foliage slightly and object detail on Ultra. Also, the shadow cascade is further out on Ultra, with PlayStation 5 having distant objects receiving no shadows and they fade in as you move. Ray trace reflections are better in PS5's fidelity mode than PC high, which themselves are better than PlayStation 5's ray trace reflections in that performance mode, but PC's very high RT reflections are slightly better than fidelity, largely due to the higher per pixel samples and denoising pass. In reality though, the differences are mostly academic during cutscenes and gameplay, but can offer a good 15 to 20% performance boost at times from high to very high, so choose wisely. Now by far the biggest visual boost over PS5's best is ray trace shadows plus ray traced ambient occlusion with a range of samples. Now due to these sharing the lower level of detail proxy objects within that BVH structure, they are a great economy of scale boost, but they are also limited for this very same reason. Just as I covered in our Spider-Man Miles review, ray trace shadows are of a lower quality and static, which can result in better diffuse edges from contact hardening, but overall they look worse as they are still static, whereas on PS5 or normal shadow maps they move. Meaning I can't recommend these at present, as you actually get worse results from it. Ambient occlusion is much better with HBAO+, Intel's own XeGTAO for better performance than SSAO or RTAO, ray traced ambient occlusion, which is the best and really benefits foliage with better occlusion on leaves and trees, as you can see with the comparisons on screen. This mix of lighting can also mean that at times PlayStation 5 looks better due to better shadow in backgrounds and at times higher texture details, such as the confetti decals missing on this shot here, or the surface noise map on the bronze slabs. Other areas such as the ambient occlusion not working correctly and messing up some objects, and overall the ultra settings of particles are probably the biggest benefit you'll see at certain times on PC, with them improving FX and rain. Other big boost comes from the hero lighting the game adds on PC's ultra setting, as you can see here, with a new shadow casting light source in real-time cutscenes, and this can change the look of materials and characters, but it can also cause bigger dips at times when they're present. In side-by-sides, it's an obvious boost, and it's nice to see some extra touches on PC, but just be aware that these are for the highest end GPUs only. In Insomniac carried the lion's share of the PS5's launch window, and Nixxes have taken up the mantle in the PC space. The amount of effort, work and changes required on this port to the drastically different and endlessly varied configurations of the PC platform should not be undervalued. The fact we have no shader compilation issues, instant loading, no stuttering menus, gameplay or long waits to start our very first play need to be applauded. When the very biggest and longest standing PC developers cannot do the same across PC releases over the past few years, this is the exception and sadly not the rule. The dynamic menu is also a benefit over the PS5 even, which requires a restart of the render whenever you change settings. Nixxes have built upon Insomniac's superb base and their own prior ports here, scaling right down to the Steam Deck and even old rusty hard drives with extensive use of direct storage GPU decompression, which would have been a mammoth undertaking. And the results are some of the best we have seen on the PC platform, but it does still have some areas for improvement unsurprisingly. Although the memory demands and GPU demands will never be drastically fixed or improved, they simply cannot be. Some memory leaks and tightening up of memory heaps is likely an area the team are still working on, as the noted issues on performance and quality could be a little higher if these were increased. The boosts on PC in ray trace shadows, ambient occlusion, performance and full ultra-wide support are welcome, but I would have liked to see ray trace reflections on water bodies which still use SSR even on the PC's very best. Maybe the team can lead into the system's RAM pools more and create large heaps for entire levels to reduce the streaming and benefit future ports, as although I recommend 32GB of system RAM and 16GB of VRAM for the best quality levels on PC, the game tends to hover around 10 to 12GB heaps as a maximum, and a dynamic allocation to exceed that if available may be a nice boost to those higher end machines that can. The requirements from a GPU perspective have increased over Spider-Man as a PS5 exclusive. That's not a surprise, and CPU requirements have actually reduced. With some more patches, I expect the game could improve 5, maybe 10% across all hardware, but this is a baseline for the requirements moving forward this generation. Nothing is lost from the PS5 to PC, but just be aware that hitting PS5 levels is going to be far higher and more aggressive than many would have expected. Nixxes have done an incredible job in delivering such quality, and with further refinement, it could be a game that becomes a benchmark in the future, in more ways than one.
Oh dear, my arm.
That's a deep dive into Rift Apart across PC, Steam Deck, and everything in between, including PlayStation 5. Remember, if you like what we do here on IGN Performance Reviews, then keep it IGN, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Someone with a lot of questions. Let's go for a ride.
Wait, I have to find my friend.